Joining us now, F.H. Buckley, professor at George Mason University School of Law. Professor Buckley, we thank you for your time and welcome you in now to America's Forum.
Thank you very much for having me.
It is good to have you there from Washington, D.C. So you have written about this president. You can analyze this as a student and, dare we say, practitioner of constitutional law. How do you interpret yesterday's unanimous decision? Is this a rebuke of the president for executive overreach?
Yeah, it's certainly a rebuke. My interpretation is what we're beginning to see is a split in the Supreme Court between what you might call a presidentialist wing and a congressional wing. And the presidentialist wing, composed essentially of the liberals on the court, are more likely to uphold presidential power. And the more conservative judges are more likely to strike it down. And at this time, we can more or less foresee a string of Democratic presidents in the future, so this is entirely to be expected. Well, yeah, there was a rebuke, but it's a mild rebuke.
And correct me if I'm wrong, isn't this the 13th unanimous decision against the Obama administration when it comes to institutional or constitutional questions?
You're right, but on the narrow issue of separation of powers, the decision yesterday was one where you really had a split court on just what the president could do about recess appointments. There's one other thing. The recess appointments clause was a pretty narrow clause, so in other respects, on the broad power of the president, we have yet to hear the Supreme Court speak. And in general, the court stays away from political issues. And this then is largely a turf battle between the other two branches, Congress and the presidency. And we wait to see Congress act.
And Professor Buckley,
pick up the ball.
Professor Buckley, in a sense, to quote Solomon, I guess, who said this scripturally, there's really nothing new under the sun. There have been these disputes in the past. I think of the mid-20th century, and in the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis, some historians coming away from that saying that in the nuclear age, our commander-in-chief essentially has unilateral power to create war. Or to take the nation to war, whether it's declared or not, in the writings primarily about the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Of course, in the wake of Vietnam, Congress tried to come back with the War Powers Act. Now, you cited what you believe to be, politically speaking, the likelihood or the probability that the Democrats will maintain control of the executive branch. What do you think the Congress can do institutionally to reassert the balance of power, or will we increasingly be looking at the courts and future decisions made by the Supreme Court as we saw yesterday?
Well, I've written about this in my book, The Once and Future King. I don't think we're looking to the courts. I think we're looking at the other two branches. The courts tend to stay away from political issues, as I mentioned, and on the commander-in-chief power, yeah, the commander-in-chief has the power, it seems, to take the country to war, and that's something that would have really horrified the framers. It's not what they wanted.
Well, as we take a look at this, and it is worth noting, we've referenced your book. Let me make sure that people understand the exact title so they can get it for themselves and read your rationale and arguments in detail. The Once and Future King, The Rise of Crown Government in America. Professor Buckley, just for those of us who even bristle when we hear our republic referred to as a democracy, with that mislabeling, to hear you title The Rise of Crown Government in America, it gives us pause. How much of this...
I thought that would get your goat.
It does get my goat, Professor Buckley, and it raises the concerns. And another question, how much of this is based on the outlook, the imprimatur, and the tendencies of one Barack Obama, and how much of this is institutional and the give and take among the three theoretically separate and co-equal branches of government?
Well, the answer is both. I mean, presidential power has been slowly accumulating. There have been moments where we've seen a retreat, notably in Congress right after Richard Nixon. but it's been steadily increasing, and in particular in the last couple of years. And what happened in the last couple of years is you have divided government, and you have the president saying, well, if Congress doesn't act, I've got to do it by myself. And he's doing this to the cheers of a whole bunch of people, particularly in the mainstream media.
Well, with that in mind, Professor Buckley, and obviously your background in the law, perhaps it's unfair to ask you these questions, but based on your study both of this administration and what is happening institutionally, we are getting mixed signals. The president, when it comes to the situation on our border, in an interview with ABC News saying, look, to the people of Central America, do not send your children here. But Press Secretary Josh Earnest, speaking to that press that you just made mention of, saying, quote, we're just not going to sit around and wait for Congress to write laws. Based on your knowledge of our history, and we can look back to Abraham Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation. We can look at Jimmy Carter as Commander-in-Chief, granting a general amnesty to those Vietnam-era draft evaders. Do you expect or do you believe President Obama unilaterally will move to declare a general amnesty and de facto open borders via executive order?
Gosh, I'd like to think not. It's very possible it will happen. And as for the title of my book and the reference to Crown government, what I argue is that we're moving to a regime where the president has the kind of power George III would have envied, and that's what the revolution was all about. Presidential governments in general are notoriously likely to slip into one-man rule. That's what happened elsewhere, and America's been the great exception. And my argument is we are a free country in spite of our Constitution and not because of it.
Now, that is an interesting thought, because it brings to mind, since George Mason is there in Virginia, I think about what surrounded the Constitutional Convention. Patrick Henry, governor of Virginia, famously said, "I smell a rat," about those who gathered in the 1780s. Tell us where you stand on the Constitution of the United States, because on 6 occasions I raised my right hand and took an oath to uphold and defend that Constitution as a member of Congress. What should be the course of action by the Congress? What is your outlook of the reasonable and proper place and role of the Constitution within our republic?
Well, as for the future, who knows, and never bet against the home team, but you mentioned George Mason, and George Mason was the fellow who said what we're going to have is what he called an elected monarchy, and he said that's going to be worse than the real thing, hereditary monarchy, and that's why he didn't sign the Constitution. But I honor you for your service to the country and for swearing to uphold the Constitution, and the Constitution to be upheld is the Constitution of the framers, where they were specifically and more than anything worried about what we're getting, the one-man rule of an all-powerful president.
The Constitution, a document of limited and enumerated powers, as opposed to a document with hidden meanings and penumbra and different shadows and different sentiments based on different political passions at a given time in our history. Professor Buckley, the last word to you. When people pick up The Once and Future King, The Rise of Crown Government in America, what do you hope they come away with after reading your book?
What I hope they come away with is a fear for what presidential regimes are likely to do, but more than anything, a reverence for the framers who gave us our Constitution, the best, wisest set of people ever assembled in one place at one time.
Professor Buckley, we appreciate your comments today on the current situation we confront, and we appreciate your contribution to our knowledge of the Constitution and the proper role for that Constitution in your book, The Once and Future King, The Rise of Crown Government in America. We look forward to calling on you in the days ahead for more insights as we continue to monitor the situation in Washington, D.C. We thank you, sir, coming to us from the nation's capital today.
Thank you, sir.
So, we heard from Professor Buckley He says the Constitution essentially is a document of limited and enumerated powers. What will it take for us to return to a constitutional republic? Is it as simple as a change in executive leadership? Why don't you tweet us your comments at Newsmax TV, #America's Forum. There is also email. Our address is connect@newsmaxtv.com. And don't forget Facebook, facebook.com/Newsmax.